The American Yawp, Chapter 13. The Civil War, Section 4, War for Emancipation, 1863-1865. As Union armies penetrated deeper into the Confederacy, politicians and generals came to understand the necessity and benefit of enlisting African American men in the Army and Navy. Although a few commanders began forming black units in 1862, such as Massachusetts abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson's 1st South Carolina Volunteers, widespread enlistment did not occur until the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1, 1863. And I further declare and make known, Lincoln's proclamation read, that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. The language describing black enlistment indicated Lincoln's implicit desire to segregate African American troops from the main campaigning armies of white soldiers. I believe it is a resource which, if vigorously applied now, will soon close the contest. It works doubly, weakening the enemy and strengthening us, Lincoln remarked in August 1863 about black soldiering. Although more than 180,000 black men served during the war, most United States colored troops remained stationed behind the lines as garrison forces, often laboring and performing non-combat roles. Black soldiers in the Union Army endured rampant discrimination and earned less pay than white soldiers, while also facing the possibility of being murdered or sold into slavery if captured. James Henry Gooding, a black corporal in the famed 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, wrote to Abraham Lincoln in September 1863, questioning why he and his fellow volunteers were paid less than white men. Gooding argued that because he and his brethren were born in the United States and selflessly left their private lives to enter the army, they should be treated as American soldiers, not as menial hirelings. African American soldiers defied the inequality of military service and used their positions in the Army to reshape society in the North and South. The majority of the USCT had once been enslaved, and their presence as armed, blue-clad soldiers sent shock waves throughout the Confederacy. To their friends and families, African American soldiers symbolized the embodiment of liberation and the destruction of slavery. To white Southerners, they represented the utter disruption of the Old South's racial and social hierarchy. As members of the armies of occupation, black soldiers wielded martial authority in towns and plantations. At the end of the war, as a black soldier marched by a cluster of Confederate prisoners, he noticed his former enslaver among the group. "Hello, massa," the soldier exclaimed. "Bottom rail on top this time." Leaders in the African American community recognized the greater importance of this military service. Through their martial valor on the battlefield, such leaders hoped black soldiers would convince white Northerners to grant their race full and equal rights. As Frederick Douglass argued, let the black man get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and none could refuse him the right of citizenship. Douglass, Henry Highland Garnet, and other black leaders threw their all into recruiting for the new USCT regiments to make this dream a reality. The majority of the USCT occupied the South by performing garrison duty. Other black soldiers performed admirably on the battlefield, shattering white myths that docile, cowardly black men would fold in the maelstrom of war. Black troops fought in more than 400 battles and skirmishes, including Milliken's Bend and Port Hudson, Louisiana, Fort Wagner, South Carolina, Nashville, and the final campaigns to capture Richmond, Virginia. 15 black soldiers received the Medal of Honor, the highest honor bestowed for military heroism. Through their voluntarism, service, battlefield contributions, and even deaths, black soldiers successfully made their claims for citizenship. Many enslaved laborers accompanied their enslavers in the Confederate Army. They served their enslavers as camp servants, cooking their meals, raising their tents, and carrying their supplies. The Confederacy also impressed enslaved laborers to perform manual labor. There are three key points to make about these enslaved Confederates. First, their labor was almost always coerced. Second, people are complicated and have varying, often contradictory loyalties. An enslaved person could yearn for freedom and the Confederacy's collapse, but at the same time be concerned for the safety of his enslaver and the rebel soldiers he saw daily. And finally, white Confederates did not see African Americans as their equals, much less as soldiers. There was never any doubt that black laborers and camp servants were property. It is a stretch to claim that no enslaved person ever fired a gun for the Confederacy. A camp servant whose enslaver died in battle might well pick up his dead enslaver's rifle and continue firing, if for no other reason than to protect himself. But this would always have been on an informal basis. As a last act of desperation, the Confederate government did pass a law in March 1865 allowing for the enlistment of black soldiers. Only a few dozen African Americans signed up by the war's conclusion, however. African Americans never served on a battlefield as enlisted Confederate soldiers, despite modern-day claims to the contrary. As 1863 dawned, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia continued its offensive strategy in the East. One of the war's major battles occurred near the village of Chancellorsville, Virginia, from April 30 to May 6, 1863. While the Battle of Chancellorsville was a stunning Confederate victory, it also resulted in heavy casualties and the mortal wounding of an important Confederate commander, Major General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was killed by friendly fire. Despite Jackson's death, Lee continued his offensive against Federal forces and invaded Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. During the three-day battle at Gettysburg, heavy casualties crippled both sides. But after a failed and devastating infantry assault on July 3 against the Union center, known as Pickett's Charge, Lee retreated from Pennsylvania. The Gettysburg campaign was Lee's final incursion into the North. The Battle of Gettysburg remains the bloodiest battle of the war, and in American history, with 51,000 casualties. In the West, meanwhile, Union forces continued their movement along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. Grant launched his campaign against Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the winter of 1862. Known as the Gibraltar of the West, Vicksburg was the last Confederate strongpoint on the Mississippi River, and its seizure would enable uninhibited Union travel along the waterway. Grant's Vicksburg campaign ended with the city's surrender on July 4, 1863. The fall of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two. Despite Union success in the summer of 1863, discontent over the war simmered across the North. This was particularly true in the wake of the Enrollment Act, which initiated a draft of military-age men in the North. Working-class Northerners were especially angry that the wealthy could pay $300 for substitutes, sparing themselves from the carnage of war. A rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, went a popular refrain. The Emancipation Proclamation convinced many immigrants in northern cities that freed slaves would soon take their jobs. These racial and economic anxieties culminated in the New York City draft riots in July 1863. White rioters killed some 120 citizens over the span of 4 days, lynching at least 11 black New Yorkers. Property damage was in the millions, including the destruction of more than 50 properties, most notably that of the Colored Orphan Asylum. It was the largest civil disturbance to date in the United States and was only stopped by the deployment of Union soldiers, some of whom came directly from the battlefield at Gettysburg 47. The North was also capable of impressive acts of unity. Sanitary fairs originated in the Old Northwest and raised millions of dollars for supplies for Union soldiers. Indeed, many women rose to take pivotal leadership roles in the sanitary fairs, making strong contributions to the Union war effort. The fairs also encouraged national unity within the North, something that became more important as the war dragged on and casualties continued to mount. The Northern home front remained ever complicated. Overt displays of loyalty contrasted with violent dissent. A similar situation played out in the Confederacy. The Confederate Congress passed its first Conscription Act in the spring of 1862, a full year before its Northern counterpart. Military service was required from all able-bodied males between ages 18 and 35. Notable class exemptions likewise existed in the Confederacy. Those who owned 20 or more enslaved laborers could escape the draft. Popular discontent reached a boiling point in 1863. Throughout the spring of 1863, consistent food shortages led to bread riots in several Confederate cities, most notably Richmond and the Georgia cities of Augusta, Macon, and Columbus. Confederate women led these mobs to protest food shortages and rampant inflation within the Confederate South. Exerting their own political control, women dramatically impacted the war through violent actions in these cases, as well as constant petitions to governors for aid and the release of husbands from military service. One such woman wrote a letter to North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance, pleading, especially for the sake of suffering women and children, do try and stop this cruel war. Confederates waged a multi-front struggle against Union incursion and internal dissent. Some women supported their respective sides by spying on the enemy. When the war broke out, Rose O'Neal Greenhow was living in Washington. Utilizing her role as a well-regarded socialite in the capital, she began gathering information for her Confederate contact. Suspecting Greenhow of espionage, Allen Pinkerton of the Union Intelligence Service placed her under surveillance, instigated a raid on her house to gather evidence, and then put her under house arrest, after which she was incarcerated in Old Capitol Prison. Upon her release, she was sent, under guard, to Baltimore, Maryland. From there, Greenhow went to Europe to attempt to bring support to the Confederacy. Having failed to curry favor, Greenhow decided to return to America aboard the blockade runner Condor. The ship ran aground off the North Carolina coast, however, and Greenhow ultimately drowned when her lifeboat capsized in a storm. While Greenhow gave her life for the Confederate cause, Elizabeth Crazy Bet Van Lew sacrificed her social standing for the Union. A member of a prominent Richmond family who harbored anti-slavery sympathies, Van Lew organized a Union spy ring in the Confederate capital, leading to her being held in contempt and scorn by the narrow-minded men and women of my city for my loyalty. 49 indeed, when General Ulysses Grant took control of Richmond, he detailed a special guard to protect Van Lew. In addition to her espionage activities, Van Lew also acted as a nurse to Union prisoners in Libby Prison. Pro-Confederate Southern women, meanwhile, were eager to show their scorn for the enemy. Some women in New Orleans went so far as to dump their chamber pots onto the heads of unsuspecting Federal soldiers standing underneath their balconies, leading to Benjamin Butler's infamous General Order No. 28, which arrested all rebellious women as prostitutes. Military strategy shifted in 1864. The new tactics of hard war evolved slowly, as restraint towards Southern civilians and property gave way to a concerted effort to demoralize Southern civilians and destroy the Southern economy. Grant's successes at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, Tennessee, as well as Meade's overly cautious pursuit of Lee after Gettysburg, prompted Lincoln to promote Grant to commanding general of the United States Army in early 1864. This change in command brought some of the bloodiest battles of the Eastern Theater. Grant launched the Overland Campaign to take Richmond, demonstrating his willingness to tirelessly grind down the ever-dwindling Army of Northern Virginia. The two armies clashed repeatedly in the horrific battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. By June 1864, Grant's army surrounded the Confederate depot of Petersburg, Virginia. Siege operations cut off Confederate forces and supplies from the capital of Richmond. Out west, meanwhile, Union armies under the command of William Tecumseh Sherman implemented hard war strategies and made their way through central Tennessee and northern Georgia, capturing the vital rail hub of Atlanta in September 1864. Deaths mounted in 1864 not only from the battles themselves, but also from disease. Sickness afflicted both armies and accounted for over half of all Civil War casualties. Sometimes as many as half of the men in a company could be ill. The overwhelming majority of Civil War soldiers came from rural areas, where less exposure to diseases meant soldiers lacked certain immunities. Vaccines for diseases such as smallpox were largely unavailable to those outside cities or towns. Despite the common 19th century tendency to see city men as weak or soft, soldiers from urban environments tended to succumb to fewer diseases than their rural counterparts. Tuberculosis, measles, rheumatism, typhoid, malaria, and smallpox spread almost unchecked among the armies. Civil War medicine focused almost exclusively on curing the patient rather than preventing disease. Many soldiers attempted to cure themselves by concocting elixirs and medicines themselves. These ineffective home remedies were often made from various plants the men found in woods or fields. There was no understanding of germ theory, and many soldiers did things that we would consider unsanitary today. They ate food that was improperly cooked and handled while practicing what we would consider poor personal hygiene. They did not take appropriate steps to ensure that drinking water was free from bacteria. Diarrhea and dysentery were common. These diseases proved especially dangerous, as Civil War soldiers did not understand the value of replacing fluids as they were lost. As such, men affected by these conditions would weaken and become unable to fight or march. As they became dehydrated, their immune system became less effective, inviting other infections to attack the body. Through trial and error, soldiers began to protect themselves from some of the more preventable sources of infection. Around 1862, both armies began to dig latrines rather than rely on the local waterways. Burying human and animal waste also cut down on exposure to diseases considerably. Medical surgery was limited and brutal. If a soldier was wounded in the torso, throat, or head, little could be done by surgeons. Invasive procedures to repair damaged organs or stem blood loss invariably resulted in death. Luckily for soldiers, only approximately 1 in 6 combat wounds were to one of those areas. The remaining wounds were to limbs and were only treatable by amputation. Soldiers had the highest chance of survival if the limb was removed within 48 hours of injury. A skilled surgeon could amputate a limb in 3 to 5 minutes from start to finish. While the ignorance of germ theory again resulted in numerous unsafe practices, such as using the same tools on multiple patients, wiping hands on filthy gowns, and placing hands in communal buckets of water, there is evidence that amputation offered the strongest chance of survival. It is a common misconception that amputation was done without anesthesia and against a patient's wishes. Since the 1830s, Americans understood the benefits of nitrous oxide and ether in easing pain. Chloroform and opium were also used to either render patients unconscious or dull pain during the procedure. Moreover, surgeons would not amputate without the patient's consent. In the Union Army alone, 2.8 million ounces of opium and over 5.2 million opium pills were administered. In 1862, William Alexander Hammond was appointed Surgeon General of the United States Army. He sought to regulate dosages and manage supplies of available medicines, both to prevent overdosing and to ensure that an ample supply remained for the next engagement. However, his guidelines generally applied only to the regular Federal Army. Most Union soldiers were in volunteer units and organized at the state level. Their surgeons often ignored posted limits on medicines, or worse, experimented with their own concoctions made from local flora. The conditions in Union hospitals were somewhat superior to those in the Confederacy. This was partly due to the organizational skills of women like Dorothea Dix, the Union's superintendent for Army nurses. Additionally, many women were members of the United States Sanitary Commission and helped to staff and supply hospitals in the North. Women took on key roles within hospitals, both North and South. The publisher's notice for nurse and spy in the Union Army stated, "In the opinion of many, it is the privilege of woman to minister to the sick and soothe the sorrowing, and in the present crisis of our country's history, to aid our brothers to the extent of her capacity." Mary Chesnut wrote, "Every woman in the house is ready to rush into the Florence Nightingale business." After visiting a hospital, however, she declared that, "I can never again shut out of view the sights that I saw there of human misery. I sit thinking, shut my eyes, and see it all." Hospital conditions were often so bad that many volunteer nurses quit soon after beginning. Kate Cumming volunteered as a nurse shortly after the war began. She and other volunteers traveled with the Army of Tennessee. All but one of the women who volunteered with Cumming quit within a week. Death came in many forms. Disease, prisons, bullets, even lightning and bee stings took men slowly or suddenly. Their deaths affected more than their regiments. Before the war, a wife expected to sit at her husband's bed, holding his hand and ministering to him after a long, fulfilling life. This noble type of death, the good death, disappeared during the Civil War as men died often far from home among strangers. 55 casualty reporting was inconsistent, so a woman was often at the mercy of the men who fought alongside her husband to learn not only the details of his death, but even that the death had occurred. Now I'm a widow. Ah, that mournful word. Little the world think of the agony it contains, wrote Sally Randall Perry in her diary. After her husband's death at Antietam, Sally received the label she would share with over 200,000 other women. The death of a husband and loss of financial, physical, and emotional support could shatter lives. It also had the perverse power to free women from bad marriages and open doors to financial and psychological independence. Widows had an important role to play in the conflict. The ideal widow wore black, mourned for a minimum of 2.5 years, resigned herself to God's will, focused on her children, devoted herself to her husband's memory, and brought his body home for burial. Most tried, but not all widows were able to live up to this ideal. Many widows were unable to purchase proper mourning garb. Black silk dresses, heavy veils, and other features of antebellum mourning were expensive and in short supply. Because most of these women were in their childbearing years, the war created an unprecedented number of widows who were pregnant or still nursing infants. In a time when the average woman gave birth to 8 to 10 children in her lifetime, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Civil War created so many widows who were also young mothers with little free time for formal mourning. Widowhood permeated American society. But in the end, it was up to each widow to navigate her own mourning. She joined the ranks of sisters, mothers, cousins, girlfriends, and communities in mourning men. By the fall of 1864, affairs in the North played out against the backdrop of the upcoming presidential election. This contest featured a transformed electorate. 3 new states had been added since 1860, while the 11 states of the Confederacy did not participate. Lincoln and his vice presidential nominee, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, ran as the National Union Party to attract conservative Unionists into the Republican fold. The main competition came from his former commander, General George B. McClellan. Though McClellan himself was a war Democrat, the Copperhead-friendly official platform of the Democratic Party in 1864 revolved around negotiating an immediate end to the war. McClellan's vice presidential nominee was George H. Pendleton of Ohio, a well-known Copperhead. Lincoln and McClellan each needed 117 electoral votes to win the presidency on November 8. Lincoln doubted his chances of re-election throughout the campaign season, while McClellan assumed that large numbers of Union soldiers would grant him support. But thanks in great part to William Sherman's capture of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, as well as overwhelming support from Union troops, Lincoln easily won the election. He ultimately consolidated support from more radical Republican factions and members of the Radical Democracy Party, which demanded the end of slavery. Lincoln defeated McClellan in the popular vote, 55.1% to 44.9%. In the Electoral College, Lincoln's victory was even more pronounced, 212 to 21. Lincoln won 22 states, while McClellan only carried 3: New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. In the wake of his re-election, Abraham Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, in which he concluded in soaring rhetoric, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Throughout late 1864 and 1865, the conflict ground on, proving incredibly deadly for both sides. Hard war Union campaigns in the West and the East destroyed Confederate infrastructure and demonstrated the efficacy of the Union's strategy. Following his successful capture of Atlanta, William Sherman initiated his march to the sea in November 1864, arriving in Savannah in time to capture it and deliver it as a Christmas present for Abraham Lincoln. Sherman's path of destruction took on an even more destructive tone as he moved into the heart of the Confederacy in South Carolina in early 1865. The burning of Columbia, South Carolina, and subsequent capture of Charleston brought the hard hand of war to the birthplace of secession. In the East, Grant's ever-tightening siege of Petersburg finally forced Lee to abandon his lines and flee south, leaving Richmond to Union forces. After a dogged pursuit, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, ending major Confederate military operations. Peace came at last, at least in theory. To ensure the permanent destruction of slavery, Republicans drafted and passed the 13th Amendment during the war. Yet, the legal end of slavery did not mean the end of racial injustice. Disease-ridden contraband camps remained even after emancipation. After the war, the Republican Reconstruction Program of guaranteeing the rights of Black Americans succumbed to persistent racism and white Southern violence. Long after 1865, most Black Southerners continued to labor on plantations, albeit as nominally free tenants or sharecroppers, while facing public segregation and disfranchisement. Slavery's effects endured long after abolition. Section 5 Conclusion. As the guns fell silent in 1865, the question of secession had been answered, slavery had been eradicated, and the Union was territorially restored. But, in many ways, the conclusion of the Civil War created more questions than answers. How would the nation become one again? Who was responsible for rebuilding the South? What role would African Americans occupy in this society? Northern and Southern soldiers returned home with broken bodies, broken spirits, and broken minds. Plantation owners had land but not labor. Recently freed African Americans had their labor but no land. Formerly enslaved people encountered a world of possibilities, legal marriage, family reunions, employment, and fresh starts, but also one of prejudice, violence, and limited opportunity. The Civil War may have been over, but the struggle over the peace was just beginning.